build off of that by trying to understand the psychology of what's happening in these police use of force incidents. So focusing on the way that racial stereotypes impact police use of force in these decision-making interactions. I'm Dr. Kimberly Barsamian Kahn. I'm an associate professor of social psychology here at Portland State. And my general area of research then is how subtle forms of stereotypes, prejudice, and bias impact judgments and decision-making within the criminal justice system broadly, and then specifically looking at police use of force interactions. So what's happening during these interactions, and how do both explicit as well as more subtle implicit forms of stereotypes impact the way our perceptions are made, the judgments are ultimately decided, and force is actually enacted. So I focus on these police-citizen interactions in that regard. A lot of my work is also done in collaboration with the Center for Policing Equity. I highly recommend you check out this organization if you're interested in police use of force and racial profile and racial justice issues. This is a collaboration of academics across various different domains, partnering with about 50 or so at this point, the number keeps going up, police departments across the United States to study racial equity issues, both within the department and then in interactions with community members. So these are police departments that have voluntarily partnered with the Center for Policing Equity, opened up a lot of data which to this point have been proprietary and kept in-house to actually start to try to understand and of course remediate what we're seeing in these patterns. As part of this group, I've also done work with the Portland Police as well. So if we think about the broad issue of racial bias in policing, as we just saw in the last presentation, we have a lot of data that shows the racial disparities across outcomes through pretty much every policing interaction. So we see that racial minorities, Blacks, Latinos, and others are disproportionately represented in stops, in searches. They're often less likely to actually have contraband when they're searched. So what's happening is that we're stopping and searching a much higher rate of racial minorities who then do not actually have contraband being found. Arrested, and of course disparities in police use of force. So what the social psychological perspective can help add to understanding these disparities is what's really causing this. What is the causal role that race and racial stereotypes are playing in these types of interactions that is leading to the disparities in outcomes that we see. So when we look across these different patterns, how can we understand and break down what's happening and what are the psychological processes that are occurring? So if we think about then the psychology, what's happening in these interactions, we want to understand just the basics of how our brain processes information. So first off, we have developed a dual processing system that helps us take in and process the vast amount of social information that we're exposed to on a daily basis. So we have two different ways that we can process information to be able to interact in a complex social world. And the first system that we have is this really automatic based processing. This occurs at a millisecond level. We're not consciously aware of it. It's sort of always going on in the background, and yet it's influencing how we perceive and make judgments. This is then combined with our secondary processing, which is more deliberative or called controlled processing. And this is what we think about as our kind of conscious and deliberative thoughts. So those two systems then work together to help us come to decisions and make judgments. Now, what we see when we study the brain processes associated with this is that we've developed a lot of mental shortcuts or heuristics or schemas to help us jump to a decision and evaluation quickly. And this is essentially what's happening when we are using stereotypes. The stereotype then predisposes us, makes us fill in information to confirm that stereotype and allow us to make a really quick decision and jump to a decision without processing information through each of the different levels. So when these stereotypes are salient, we are relying then on this incomplete information. The stereotype is helping disambiguate information and leading us to make decisions that are biased and in line with the stereotype. So we're no longer actually perceiving reality in an objective manner. We're actually seeing it distorted through the lens of that stereotype. So that's a basic way that our brain processes information. What does that look like then when we think about the stereotypes relevant in a policing encounter or a policing situation? And of course, one of the relevant stereotypes is our race crime implicit association or stereotype that we see. So this is a very pervasive societal stereotype that links racial minorities with criminality, violence, danger, being associated with that fear response that was talked about in the earlier presentation. We see this stereotype exist both at an explicit level, that people are consciously believing, endorsing, and acting in line with that stereotype, but we also see it at an implicit level, and it tends to be much more pervasive at that implicit level. When we look at the pervasiveness of this stereotype using different measures like the implicit association test, we see that the vast majority of individuals, about three-quarters of Americans, looking across millions of responses, hold some level of this association in which they are overly associating racial minorities with guns, with danger, with criminality and violence. And because then of the pervasiveness of this stereotype, we see the strength of this stereotype both in community members who can act on this stereotype by, for example, calling the police on African Americans in particular situations, as well as all of our research with police officers hold this same stereotype, both at the implicit and explicit level. So how does this race crime stereotype that we know police officers hold affect police? And one way that it does this is it actually distorts visual processing. So the more people hold this race crime stereotype, the more that our vision and perceptions are biased in accordance to support and see things in line with that stereotype. So for example, in a variety of different types of studies, we're able to look at how race impacts the perceptions or visual processing associated with identifying guns, for example. When individuals are primed or think or exposed to black faces, they are faster to identify a degraded object that is a crime-related object. So we see it faster because it's matching that stereotype. We also see the reverse pattern where when black faces, for example, are paired with neutral objects, so things like tools or neutral objects like a cell phone, it takes us longer to actually recognize that object that is not harmful when we are exposed to black faces because it's not matching our stereotype. So we see this basic difference in visual processing where when things match that stereotype, we're faster and we jump to responses to confirm that stereotype. Basically, once that stereotype is primed, it affects all of our downstream processing to confirm that stereotype. So we know then that these racial stereotypes impact our visual processing. Well, what about the actual decision making that is made then based off of that distorted visual processing? And of course, we do see that that visual processing then leads to decision making and distorted decision making that is in line with the stereotype. So when we look at this within policing, for example, we see that that race crime stereotype biases our perceptions to correctly identify weapons, when force is used, and decisions to shoot. And we can do this and look at the causal effect of these stereotypes on decision making by running police officers and community members through various simulations where we're able to isolate the effect of that racial stereotype on these decisions to shoot and behavioral interactions. So we can do this through different live action scenarios. For example, like you see on the right there, where officers are going through hypothetical simulations with both compliant and non-compliant suspects, and we track their behavior. We can also do it, again, at a more perceptual level, where we have, for example, black and white individuals holding either guns or dangerous objects, or holding neutral objects like a wallet or a cell phone, and track their responses. When do people decide to shoot, and when do they correctly identify non-threatening objects and decide to not shoot? So through these different simulations, we can track these patterns of responses. And what we see in this research, generally termed shooter bias, is that people's decision makings are biased in line and in accordance with the racial stereotypes. So what we see is people are more likely to mistakenly shoot unarmed racial minorities compared to unarmed whites. And they're faster, they jump to shoot individuals, armed individuals when they're black compared to when they are white. So people are making these types of mistaken shooting patterns where the only thing that's varying here, and this is how we can understand causality, is the race and the racial stereotypes of the individuals. Everything else is controlled, everything else is identical, yet we're perceiving these outcomes, perceiving these situations differently, and leading to different mistaken shooting decisions. When we break down the pattern of behavior, what we tend to see is that individuals and officers adopt a more liberal shooting criterion when it's an African American and they are armed. So when they are unarmed. So essentially, people require less evidence, require less visual confirmation before deciding to shoot when it's a black individual compared to a majority group member. So we'll allow more ambiguity before we decide, yes, I'm going to pull the trigger, compared to with white individuals. And that leads to the pattern where people are more likely to mistakenly shoot unarmed racial minorities compared to majority group members. So again, this sort of bias pattern is referred to as shooter bias. In these quick shooting decisions, things are happening at that automatic processing level, and it's all being driven by the racial stereotypes that link racial minorities with danger. So essentially what's happening is when people are exposed to this small amount of information, the stereotypes then bias and fill in the perceptions and lead people to act on those biased perceptions. So people are misperceiving or actually thinking that the neutral object like a wallet or a cell phone really is something dangerous and worthy to shoot, because the stereotype is primed and is influencing those perceptions. And we see this pattern then with really any group that has a race danger stereotype associated with them. So we see this with African American individuals, Latinx, Muslims. In some of my own work, even looking at subtle differences in skin tone. So not only do we see more of these biased shooting decisions against Black compared to white individuals, for example, when we break down and look within that category, people are still at this implicit automatic level more likely to mistakenly shoot darker-skinned African Americans compared to lighter-skinned African Americans. So we see that bias both across groups as well as within groups. And again, a lot of this is happening at a millisecond level in the ways that the stereotypes are activated and influencing our perceptions. We've also studied directly officers' racial attitudes. And so when we look at giving officers, for example, implicit measures of race crime stereotypes and explicit prejudice measures, and then we're able to track their behavior in the field for 2 years. So we look at then, at that individual officer level, what was their behavior in the field with different community members? And is that connected to those racial attitudes? And we do see a strong connection, again, with implicit bias and with these racial stereotypes. So the more individuals are endorsing at the implicit and explicit level these racial stereotypes, linking particular groups with criminality and danger, we see that predict the number of complaints filed by minorities against individual officers, as well as differential use of force for minorities compared to whites. So we see an association there, but that the more people are holding and endorsing these types of stereotypes, the more their behavior in the field then reflects that biased interaction. In some more of my own work, we've looked at actually breaking down what's happening step by step in these police suspect interactions and what's differentially unfolding when, for example, it's a white suspect compared to a racial minority suspect. And we're able to do this by having access to police narratives. So after there is a relevant, after there's a use of force incident, the responding officer has to write a step-by-step recollection of what occurred in those interactions. So this is still, of course, only from the officer's perspective, but we can break that down into discrete sequences or step-by-step suspect action and officer reaction to see how those two things pair together and build to eventually use force. And what we see when we break down these individual suspect action, police action sequences unfolding over time is that with Black and Latino individuals, officers jump and start at higher levels of force quicker. So what we tend to see is that there's more back and forth interactions, there's more attempts to de-escalate with white suspects than there are with Black and Latino suspects. So they're starting at that higher level and jumping to higher levels of force without allowing that back and forth dialogue or ways to reduce the, potentially de-escalate that interaction. So we see that Black and Latino suspects receive force earlier in the sequences. And when we're controlling, again, for all the different relevant case variables that are happening in those interactions, we also see a disparity when there's any form of non-compliance or form of resisting. So the same level of resistance is met with more force when the individual's resisting is Black or Latino compared to a white individual. So on that same type of action, it's being met with larger amounts of force because then that same resistance is interpreted through the lens of those stereotypes and seen as more threatening, and officers respond with higher levels of force. So when we can break down these interactions, we have a better idea of understanding where those stereotypes are influencing the interaction. And again, particularly at these early stages, when things are potentially more ambiguous, officers are coming into the scene and they're taking in information at that initial level, that's where our stereotypes are influencing and filling in that information and leading them to think that something is more threatening than it actually is. And it's all, again, through the lens of that stereotype. And I just want to mention, we also see not just negative increased levels of force, for example, against racial minorities, but in our work we also see the protection that whiteness provides individuals. So we see both patterns playing out here. There's just one example study that we looked at here. We're able to access the booking photographs of individuals who were arrested after a force incident, and we're able to have access to all of the case variables, so we're controlling for all of the relevant case things. And we can see in research then that racial minorities, and the darker skinned they are, the more that's associated with force. But we've also seen this protective factor for white individuals. So essentially, the whiter an individual appears, the less officers use force against them. Again, controlling for the same types of situations, case histories, backgrounds. When the individual appears more white, they're stereotyped and seen as safer, and officers are responding with more protection and less force. So when we think about those disparities that I talked about in the beginning, it's coming both from anti-racial minority bias and stereotypes, as well as the protective factor of whiteness and the stereotypes that are protecting white individuals as well. So what we can see then across my work when we look at the psychology of what's happening here is that obviously race is influencing a range of police decision making. We see this not just at decisions to shoot, but really across the whole use of force continuum, from low levels of force to ultimate shooting decisions. The stereotypes are biasing those interactions at each step in that decision-making point. And importantly, with the simulations that we're able to do, we're able to actually show the causal effect that these stereotypes are having on police behavior and decision making. So we can look at that causal evidence paired with the disparity patterns that we see in the field and use that to understand the causal role that these stereotypes are having on these outcomes. We see that this bias is pervasive when we look at different types of methods and samples with experiments, again, where we're able to isolate causality, field studies, and archival analysis of police records, so we're able to actually go to that source material. And of course, intervention work, things that I've worked on as well. When we think about just remediating this type of process, it needs to be done both at the individual officer level in counteracting these stereotypes, but we also need to think about that within the larger structural level change and policies that are promoting different types of behavior and the interaction between those things, producing these patterns. So if you're interested in learning more about this, there's more information. These studies are also on my lab research website, which is the Gender, Race, and Sexual Prejudice Lab. I recently co-edited a whole special volume that's looking at understanding police violence against racial and ethnic minorities. And please check out the Center for Policing Equity site, who's doing a lot of really progressive work and working directly with, partnering with police departments to try to counteract this bias. Thank you. Questions? Yes.
Thanks for your presentation. I'm just wondering, I might have missed it. Did you discuss any variation between officers by race and ethnicity of the officer?
So sometimes that information is the most protected by police unions and having access to that. What we tend to see in the limited information that we have is that white officers certainly show this pattern. We do see that racial minority officers can show this same pattern. It tends to be weaker, but because these stereotypes can be operating at that automatic level, we can see that black officers can also hold these same types of implicit associations and can act on them as well. So having diversity in a force is incredibly important. It's a very necessary step, but it doesn't mean that these types of biases will go away. Thank you. Eve.
Hi. Thank you so much for that presentation. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about strategies for remedies, because one of the challenges that I have with this is there's a certain way that the discrimination and the biases seem really baked in. But so too is the lack of accountability is also baked in. So in that context, it makes it really difficult to figure out a way to move forward. Could you talk about some of the strategies that folks are exploring that help us think of a way out of this baked-in scenario?
Absolutely. So obviously when we're thinking about the automatic nature of these stereotypes, that is incredibly hard to change. But we do have evidence that it can change, and not everyone shows this pattern. So the more that we are exposed to and have interactions with diverse groups, with counter-stereotypic examples, those are all things that help break down the stereotype. When we're actually looking at those shooting decisions, there are training programs that we do with police that help break down the stereotype and break that automatically activated link between the stereotype and behavior. So on those specific things, we do see different intervention programs working with that. But most importantly, at the officer level, one, there has to be awareness or understanding that people even can hold these biases and it can impact their behavior. So that educational piece is really important, and you do see that police departments across the country, including the Portland Police, are now instituting implicit bias trainings. However, one training alone is not going to ever remediate these types of biases. So what has to happen is that it's a continued effort and continued discussion rather than a one-time isolated training that needs to then take place within a larger department level change and evaluation where people are examining policies, different promotional and accountability tracks that actually focus on these types of incidents and behaviors. And actually use that to change the norms and the whole structure of the department, paired with that individual level motivation to not let those biases change, to not let those biases impact behavior, and to eventually break down those biases. So it has to be paired in that effort. So I think the more discussion we have of implicit bias and these stereotypes, at least having those in police departments is a step, but it can't be the only step or a check the box type mentality. Well, we did that training, that's gone and we don't have to think about that anymore. It needs to be an actual genuine long-term commitment, both at the individual and department-wide level. Thanks. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could speak to any part of gender as a part of this, in terms of the gender of officers or the gender of those who are shot.
Yeah, so great question. As we saw in the last talk, that when we look at specifically gender and those gender stereotypes, most of shooting and use of force victims are male compared to female. We do see that Black women can also be targeted by these stereotypes, but they tend to be a little bit less compared to racial minority men. So we see that danger stereotype is more strongly associated with minority males in those situations. So while we do see a bias compared to Black women and white women, we see a stronger pattern when we look at men, Black. The vast majority depends on the organization, but usually 85 to 90% of officers are male. We tend to see some small differences that males are more likely to use force compared to females, but we also see this bias happening with female officers as well.
Okay, thank you. How about female officers of color?
In the same way that when we look at that sort of intersectional group, again, there are not as many of those. We can still see that bias, and sometimes we actually can see racial minority officers actually overly use force as a way to signal that, hey, I'm with you, I'm part of the blue officer group, and distance themselves from the minority community. So we do see sort of both processes playing out there.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.